Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for the 2nd of November. And I hope you all had a safe and enjoyable Halloween. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we are now registering students for next semester. I believe you should have received notification that we are going to be remaining online for the majority of classes next semester. And you can find our class schedule on the GCC website, and I've included a link for that so that you can search for classes both during the intersession and also during the spring semester. And for those of you who are interested in the Gothic, I will be once again offering my horror film class for next semester if it turns out that you think you'd like to continue to examine this idea of the Gothic in the way that it has basically unfolded with our horror films over the course of the last century or so. In terms of paper number 1, that's going to be due today at midnight via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, and expect that it's going to take me a little bit of time in order to get those papers back to you because I wanted to evaluate them in terms of grammar and mechanics as well as content. And you will receive those papers back before you need to submit in your second paper, however, so that you can use that feedback for paper number 2. And everybody has the option of rewriting paper number 1. So after I've reviewed it and I put my comments on it and a letter grade, as opposed to a checkmark grade, which is what I've been doing with the journals, then you have the option to do a revision incorporating my suggestions. And if you need further feedback, just let me know and I'll be happy to give that to you. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to hand in your revision along with the original that I evaluated, and I will look at both of them and you get the higher of the 2 grades. So basically it's the way that professional writers write, and they go through a long editorial process with lots of feedback. So I think this can be very useful. In terms of the second paper, the idea behind the second paper is that it would be due at the ending of the semester, so there wouldn't be enough time for you to do a revision. However, there have been students in the past that have been able to submit in that second paper early enough and have been able to convince me that a revision would be to their educational benefit. So that said, it's not a guarantee. It's something that you would have to negotiate with me, but everybody's got the first paper guaranteed for revision if they would so like to do so. And where we are is talking about Dracula, and I left you with watching the very iconic 1931 Universal Studios film with Bela Lugosi. That was your attendance question, asking you about why it's so iconic. As many of you indicated, part of the reason why is probably because of Bela Lugosi's performance, and there was just enough of the exotic in that performance to appeal to audience members, and there was also enough of similarity in his performance to not drive away audience members as well. Bela Lugosi learned his role phonetically. He didn't know English when he was filming that particular piece. It's one of the reasons why he enunciated his lines in the way that he did, and that's become basically the standard expectation when we think about vampires. And the first screen adaptation, however, of Dracula was not the Bela Lugosi 1931 film version. It was a German expressionistic film that you may have heard of, Nosferatu, that came out in the 1920s. And it was an unauthorized bootleg version of Dracula. And Dracula, or Bram Stoker's widow, did everything she could to prevent its production because she wasn't being compensated for it. And she had all of the copies destroyed except for one, luckily for us film buffs, because that's become in itself a very iconic film. And the vampire is portrayed very differently than the image of what we would have with Bela Lugosi. And in fact, you could see that even in the text itself, the description of the vampire is quite different than the Bela Lugosi portrayal. There was a Broadway stage version that helped to cement this idea of the vampire with the cape. And many of the trappings of the Broadway stage were translated over into the film. So, for instance, the idea of the collar, one of the reasons why the cape and the collar was there, so that on stage they could, through a trap door, make it appear that the vampire was disappearing into thin air as the vampire would descend, or the actor, I should say, would descend down the trap door, but the cape and the collar were arranged in such a way that it would still remain on stage standing. So that would denote invisibility. And again, that's part of Lugosi's costume that we've become quite familiar with. And if you had the opportunity to do any Halloween parties this year, I wouldn't at all be surprised if you encountered a vampire that looked very much like Bela Lugosi's interpretation. And as you know, the film, as films oftentimes do, it collapses the plot and the characters, so much so that even some of the names are collapsed as well. So I see the film as a very separate kind of entity than the actual text itself, though it's considered to be the first American horror film, and many of you were talking about one of the reasons why Dracula was so iconic is because it was one of the first in terms of the Universal Studio horror films. In fact, it was filmed before Frankenstein, even though the text Frankenstein was written before the text Dracula. And Lugosi was offered the role of the creature in Frankenstein, which went to Boris Karloff, and Lugosi turned it down because he said that there wasn't enough dialogue. There were just grunts. Probably the worst career move he could have made, and somewhat ironic considering that at that point he was performing his roles phonetically because he didn't know English. But it made Boris Karloff's career, and for better or worse, Lugosi was always typecast as Dracula, so much so that he was actually buried in his cape when he died. Now, originally the film had no soundtrack. I included a link that I could find online that does include a soundtrack with Philip Glass, which I think is very appropriate for the film, but that said, it's a very different sort of experience listening to a silent film where you've got basically just sound effects and dialogue. The sets obviously are incredibly gothic, these large, majestic castles that look almost like monasteries or cathedrals. And there's a very Christian element in the Dracula text, and there's also a very Christian element in the film itself. Lots of Christian imagery, and not just the usual trappings of Christianity, crucifixes and things of that nature. But if you think about something like the table that was set for Renfield, though it would be Jonathan Harker in the text, it very much looks like the kind of table you would see in a cathedral, basically an altar with chalice. And of course, the idea of blood, there's lots of Christian imagery associated with blood, that blood is life, and that we drink the blood of Christ when we attend religious service in Christianity. Now, the film code at the time indicated that the monster had to be destroyed at the end, which is exactly what we get in a very hurried ending. And I think part of it is because they were trying to keep to the hour and 15 minutes. So there's a lot of the text that's deleted in that. And in fact, when you see the ascension of our survivors as they are going up the staircase, it almost looks like they are ascending into a kind of heaven or to a kind of protected area, almost like a kind of wedding ceremony, if you will, between the two. And that's not necessarily what we get with the text itself. And this is the longest text of the semester, so we will spend more time with it. And I'm hopeful that the Halloween class also gave you a little bit of time. And I'm quite aware that you are in the midst of writing a paper, and that also is taking up some of your time. In terms of Dracula, I've always thought of it as 4 separate novels, which is how I'm going to be presenting it to us, and that might make it a little bit more easier to accept the length of this particular text. The good news is that after Dracula, I think the reading load will decrease dramatically in terms of length and also in difficulty as we get into some more contemporary pieces. But just in terms of some of the folklore associated with Dracula, Bram Stoker was brilliant in terms of the naming and choosing Dracul, which means son of the devil, who was a cruel Romanian medieval conqueror who is known for his impaling his victims. In fact, there's some woodcuts where he's eating dinner and he's surrounded by his impaled victims and his incredible cruelty. The idea of impaling is something that's associated with vampires as well. In the 1500s, now there was a serial killer by the name of Countess Bathory. She basically killed young girls and bathed in their blood in order to retain her youth. So you can see how Bram Stoker might have been inspired by some of that in terms of the idea that the blood is the life and the blood leads to everlasting youth. And going back to the beginning of the semester when we talked about Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and their friends vacationing and challenging each other to writing ghost stories. One of the stories that was written at that time by Dr. Polidori was a short story entitled The Vampire, which talked a little bit about vampire lore, and we think that Stoker was also inspired by that. So Stoker used lots of different sources in order to put together his very iconic Dracula. That said, the folklore associated with vampires has existed in just about every culture. And in terms of New England, which is the United States version of England, which is why we call it the New England. It was the place that was first settled by the British colonies. In 1793, there's records of one of the first instances recorded of vampirism. Now, there are lots of different reasons why there are recorded cases of vampirism. Some of it has to do with premature burial, which we talked about with Edgar Allan Poe as well, the idea of rising from the dead. And then also some of the diseases of the time, for instance, tuberculosis, would mimic some of the same symptoms of the vampire, the wasting away, for instance, and the pallid hue, for instance. And this said, when we think about the text Dracula, if we were to divide it up into 4 pieces, then the first book, so to speak, would be, in my opinion, the first 4 chapters, which is where we are introduced to the vampire and the vampire lore. Then we move forward to a completely different story, book 2, and that would be approximately chapters 5 to 16, where we are introduced to romance. And many of you indicated that one of the reasons why Dracula was so iconic is because of its effective mixing of genres, that it had horror and it had mystery and it also had romance. And the same can be said of the text itself. I think Bram Stoker was very clever in terms of writing different sections that would appeal to perhaps different audience interests so that he could have the widest readership possible. So if you're interested in Gothic, then you would probably be most interested in the first book, so to speak, chapters 1 through 4. If you're interested in romances, then chances are you'd be most interested in what I'm calling the second book, chapters 5 through 16. If you're interested in mysteries, and we know that mysteries oftentimes have many of the same elements of the Gothic, and in fact Edgar Allan Poe was credited with creating the modern mystery story in the way we think of it. But book 3, which would be chapters 17 to 23, is basically a mystery story. And it's Mina's mystery of what's happening to her. And then lastly, book 4, the ending, chapters 22 to 25, is very much an adventure story. It's a long chase scene, if you will. So it appeals to lots of different audiences. And we are again introduced to the epistolary novel, which is something that we saw with Frankenstein and even to some level with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Much of Dracula is told through journal writings, which would have been a very common activity during the time, especially for people of leisure. I think of our comparable social media, things like Facebook, for instance, where individuals will oftentimes post their thoughts. This is what they would have done, but they would have done so more privately in journals. We also have letters, which is how individuals would have communicated with one another, newspaper clippings, and things of that nature. And as we know with the epistolary novel, it can both lend a sense of authenticity, but it can also lead to questions about reliability of narrative. And both will be seen in Dracula. In fact, if you haven't gotten to the end of Dracula yet, it's something that's addressed at the very ending of the novel. But what I wanted to do was to focus on the first 4 chapters now, or in other words, what I've been calling the first book of Dracula, for those of you who are working your way through the novel and also writing a paper. One of the first things we're introduced in chapter 1 is that the journal is written in shorthand. At the time, that would have been seen as a modern innovation, the idea of technology, and definitely this sense of modern technology, at least for the time period of the 1800s, as compared to some of the more backward ways of antiquity illustrated by Transylvania and Dracula, are embedded within the text. So in the text is the idea that the West, in other words, Britain, would be considered civilized and rational and scientific, as opposed to the East, which would be something like Transylvania, would be uncivilized, irrational, and filled with the supernatural. Though it does turn out that the supernatural is more than just folklore. There is validity for this. When we're introduced to the character of Van Helsing, we'll see how he's able to balance both science and the rational, and the supernatural and the irrational. And this is a text that's clearly in the domain of the supernatural. Unlike something like Frankenstein or Poe, or with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where we had to try to find elements that would seem to defy the natural world, right from the very beginning, we're thrown into the idea of a supernatural world with a vampire, where we're introduced to Jonathan Harker, his name to hark, or in other words, to basically help tell the tale, which is how we begin, as he's telling us to hark. And the foreign is presented in a very negative way. So there's a good amount of xenophobia that is embedded within the text that we will be talking about further. There's also a good amount of references to eating and appetite. This is very deliberate. In fact, even in the first page, we get lots of very deliberate references to Jonathan eating dinner. And the idea is that the vampire also has this never-ending appetite, is constantly eating. But of course, the food is different than the food that would satisfy a human. And the first chapter also establishes date, St. George Day, which is May 4th. It's a day that's associated where evil things can hold sway in superstitious tradition. So we've already got the setting there. In chapter 2 is where we get all of the Gothic atmosphere, where we get this large looming castle. Remember, Gothic comes originally from an architectural term, where it was oftentimes associated with some of the great cathedrals and monasteries of the past. And definitely the castle is presented in that way. And the castle has no bell or knocker. Keep this in mind when we talk about the idea of isolation in the Gothic. It's something that we also examined with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The idea of trying to be hidden from community. And this castle is on the edge of a precipice, and this happens to be literal and also figurative, as Harker finds himself on the edge of a precipice. References to nighttime, and of course Transylvania, which has become iconically associated with vampire lore. And Jonathan is surprised to find that in this castle there's a library of English books. In fact, that's the reason why he's there, is that he's supposed to help Count Dracula, who one assumes is representative of some kind of aristocracy. So class structures will be important, both in the film. You notice nobody was very concerned when the flower girl was attacked. It was only when the upper levels of society were attacked where individuals became concerned. And we'll see something similar embedded within the text itself. But Jonathan is there to help broker a real estate deal with Count Dracula. And this gets into some of the fears of not only xenophobia, but also immigration during the time period, that foreigners would be learning the ways of English culture, buying English real estate, and basically taking over English lands. A kind of reverse imperialism, if you will, which we'll talk about further as we examine the text. Chapter 3 is where we get Jonathan's imprisonment. And in fact, on page 46, there is a rather detailed section that includes 3 female vampires. And I'll read that section to you next class. But it very much seems to be filled with the erotic, and many have actually called it a scene that is very comparable to oral sex, where the 3 vampires descend upon Jonathan, who's presented as this helpless victim. Now, Dracula interrupts this idea that they've taken it upon themselves to exert themselves over Jonathan without getting permission, but it also, I think, it is quite telling in terms of the Victorian period, which we had established with something like Jekyll and Hyde, highly repressed, particularly in terms of sexuality. And in fact, this particular section could be viewed as a kind of almost soft porn for the time period, and one that would be appropriate to read, because again, it's not presented initially as sexuality, it's presented as a vampiric attack. And certainly there are a good number of phallic references with vampires, whether it be the stake in order to kill the vampire or the vampire bite itself, which we'll also talk about as the text continues. But I wanted you to be aware of that in chapter 3 and some of the erotic and sensual nature with it associated with that. And finally, what we're introduced to with chapter 4, where we get Count Dracula, who actually is wearing Jonathan's clothes and basically taking over his identity as he's mailing letters from Jonathan. And this idea that Dracula is practicing the transformation that he will be taking to try to become an Englishman as he moves into Europe and begins to attack, most particularly, the English women of the time period. Perhaps that being also a major fear of immigration, is not just taking over a culture, but also being able to impregnate its women and to be able to dilute the blood pool, if you will. So those are some of the things for you to be looking forward to if you haven't had a chance to get to the first 4 chapters of Dracula. But I hope that at this point you're in the mid place of this text. We've got a couple of other classes devoted to it, but as I said, I wanted to revisit, if nothing else, chapter 3 and the female vampire attack next class, particularly if it turns out that you've been devoting most of your attention to that first paper, which should be due today. But again, if you need an extension, let me know. And in relation to that first paper, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long as it needs to be, for you to examine one idea or theme within one of the texts we've been reading. And thus far, what we've been talking about is we began with Frankenstein, and then we moved to Edgar Allan Poe, and then finally we concluded with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And while Dracula is certainly an option for your paper, obviously we're not done with talking about Dracula. So you could certainly save Dracula for your second paper, which is going to be very similar to the first paper, just with a different text. Though if you feel like you're up to the challenge with working with Dracula and submitting in a paper, even though we haven't talked much about it, you can certainly do that as well for your first paper. And the first 2 sets of readings that we had with Lovecraft and Stephen King were to help form some foundation of what the Gothic is. So you really wouldn't be doing a literary analysis of those pieces, but you could perhaps use some of the content of those pieces within your own literary analysis. So since I suspect you are busy, perhaps putting your final touches on the paper, I will leave it at this and then continue on next class with Dracula. I hope you're well, I'm well, and we will continue on. Take care. Bye-bye.